Hello all. Today we will discuss theme 4, thinkers, beliefs and buildings. Cultural developments, circa 600 BCE to 600 CE. Okay. A figure 4.1 depicts a sculpture from Sanji. Okay. In this chapter, we will go on a long journey across 1,000 years to read about philosophers and their attempts to understand the world they inhabited. We will also see how their ideas were compiled as oral and written texts, as well as expressed in architecture and scripture. These are indicative of the enduring influence of these thinkers had on people. While we will be focusing on Buddhism, it is important to remember that this tradition did not help in isolation. There were several other traditions, each engaged in debates and dialogues with the others. The sources that historians use to reconstruct this exciting world of ideas and beliefs include Buddhist, Jaina, and Brahminical texts, as well as a large and impressive body of material remains, including monuments and inscriptions. Among the best preserved monuments of the time is the stupa at Sanji, which is a major focus in this chapter. Okay. 4.2 figure 4.2 depicts Shah Jahan Begum, a glimpse of Sanji. Sanji in the 19th century. The most wonderful ancient buildings in the state of Bhopal are at Sanji Kanakhera, a small village under the brow of a hill, some 20 miles northeast of Bhopal, which we visited yesterday. We inspected the stone sculptures and statues of Buddha and a ancient gateway. The ruins appear to be the object of great interest to European gentlemen. Major Alexander Cunningham stayed several weeks in this neighborhood and examined these ruins most carefully. He took drawings of this place, deciphered the inscription, and bored shafts down these domes. The results of his investigations were described by him in an English work. From Shah Jahan Begum, Nawab of Bhopal, ruled 1868 to 1901. Tajul Iqbal Tariq Bhopal, A History of Bhopal. Okay, translated by H.T. Barstow. Okay, 19th century Europeans were very interested in this tuba at Sanji. In fact, the French sought Shah Jahan Begum's permission to take away the eastern gateway, which was best preserved, to be displayed in a museum in France. For a while, some Englishmen also wanted to do the same, but fortunately, both the French and English were satisfied with carefully prepared plaster cast copies, and the original remained at the site, part of Bhopal state. The rulers of Bhopal, Shah Jahan Begum, and her successor Sultan Jahan Begum, provided money for the preservation of ancient site. No wonder then John Marshall dedicated his important volumes on Sanji to Sultan Jahan. She funded the museum that was built built there, as well as the guest house where he lived, and wrote the volumes. She also funded the publication of the volumes. So if this Tuba complex has survived, it is in no small measure due to wise decisions and to good luck in escaping the eyes of railway contractors, builders, and those looking for finds to carry away to the museums of Europe. One of the most important Buddhist centers, the discovery of Sanji, has vastly transformed our understanding of early Buddhism. Today, it stands testimony to the successful restoration and preservation of a key archaeological site by the Archaeological Survey of India. Okay, figure 4.3 depicts the Great Stupa at Sanji. If you travel from Delhi to Bhopal by train, you will see the majestic Stupa complex on top of a hill, crowning it as it were. If you request the guard, he will stop the train at the little station of Sanji for 2 minutes, enough time for you to get down. As you climb up the hill, you can see the complex of structures, a large mount, and other monuments, including a temple built in the 5th century. Okay. But what is the significance of this monument? Why was the mount built, and what did it contain? Why is there a stone railing around it? Who built the complex or paid for its construction? When was it discovered? There is a fascinating story that we can uncover at Sanji, for which we must combine information from texts, sculpture, architecture, and inscriptions. Let us begin by exploring the background of the early Buddhist tradition. The background, sacrifices and debates. The the mid first millennium BCE is often regarded as turning point in the world history. It saw the emergence of thinkers such as Zarathustra in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle in Greece, and Mahavira and Gautama Buddha Mahavira and Gautam Buddha, among many others in India. They tried to understand the mysteries of existence and the relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. This was also the time when new kingdoms and cities were developing, and social and economic life was changing in a variety of ways in the Ganga Valley. These thinkers attempted to understand these developments as well. Okay, the sacrificial tradition. There were several pre-existing traditions of thought, religious belief, and practice, including the early Vedic tradition, known from the Rig Veda, compiled between circa 1500 and 1000 BCE. The Rig Veda consists of hymns in praise of variety of deities, including Agni, especially Agni, Indra, and Soma. Many of these hymns were chanted when sacrifices were performed, where people prayed for cattle, sons, good health, long life, etc. At first, sacrifices were performed collectively. Later, circa 1000 BCE to 500 BCE onwards, some were performed by the heads of households for the well-being of the domestic unit. More elaborate sacrifices, such as the Rajasuya and Ashwamedha, were performed by chiefs and kings who depended on Brahmana priests to conduct the ritual. Okay. A prayer to Agni. Here are two verses from the Rig Veda invoking Agni, the god of fire, often identified with the sacrificial fire, into which offerings were made so as to reach the other deities. Okay, verses such as these were composed in a special kind of Sanskrit known as Vedic Sanskrit. They were taught orally to men belonging to priestly families. Okay, new questions. Many ideas found in the Upanishads century, circa 6th century BCE onwards, show that people were curious about the meaning of life, the possibility of life after death, and rebirth. Was rebirth due to past actions? Such issues were hotly debated. Thinkers were concerned with understanding and expressing the nature of the ultimate reality, and others outside the Vedic tradition asked whether or not there even was a single ultimate reality. People also began speculating on the significance of the sacrificial tradition. Debates and discussions. We get a glimpse of uh, lively discussions and debates from the Buddhist texts, which mention as many as 64 sects or schools of thought. Teachers travel from place to place trying to convince one another as well as lay persons about the validity of their philosophy or the way they understood the world. Debates took place in the Kudagarashala, literally a hut with a pointed roof, or in groves where traveling mendicants halted. If a philosopher succeeded in convincing one of his rivals, the followers of the latter also became his disciples. So support for any particular sect could grow and shrink over time. Many of these teachers, including Mahavira and Buddha, questioned the authority of Vedas. They also emphasized individual agency, suggesting that men and women could strive to attain liberation from the trials and tribulations of worldly existence. This was in marked contrast to the Brahminical position, wherein, as we have seen, an individual's existence was thought to be determined by his or her birth in a specific caste or gender. Verses from Upanishad. Here are two verses from Chandoga Upanishad, a text composed in Sanskrit, circa 6th century BCE. The nature of the self. This self of mine within the heart is a is smaller than paddy or barley or mustard or millet or the kernel of a seed of millet. This self of mind within the heart is greater than the earth, greater than the intermediate space, greater than heaven, greater than these worlds. The true sacrifice, this one, the wind that blows, this is surely a sacrifice. While moving, its sacrifice sanctions, sanctifies all this. Therefore, it is indeed a sacrifice. Okay, how Buddhist texts were prepared and preserved. The Buddha and the other teachers taught orally through discussion and debate. Men and women, perhaps children as well, attended these discourses and discussed what they heard. None of the Buddha's speeches were written down during his lifetime. After his death, circa 5th to 4th century BCE, his teachings were compiled by his disciples at a council of elders or seniors at Vaishali, Pali for Vaishali in present-day Bihar. Okay, these compilations were known as Tripitaka, literally three baskets to hold different types of texts. They were first transmitted orally and then written and classified according to the length as well as subject matter. The Vinaya Pitaka included rules and regulations for those who joined the Sangha or monastic order. The Buddha's teachings were included in the Sutta Pitaka. Okay, Buddha's teachings were included in the Sutta Pitaka. Buddha's teachings were included in the Sutta Pitaka. Okay. Abhidhamma Pitaka dealt with philosophical matters. Each Pitaka comprised a number of individual texts. Later commentaries were written on these texts by Buddhist scholars. As Buddhism traveled to new regions such as Sri Lanka, other texts such as the Diba Vamsha, literally the chronicle of the island, and Mahavamsha, the Great Chronicle, were written containing regional histories of Buddhism. Many of these works contained biographies of the Buddha. Some of the oldest texts are in Pali, while later compositions are in Sanskrit. When Buddhism spread to East Asia, pilgrims such as Faxian and Xuanzang traveled all the way from China to India in search of texts. These they took back to their own country where they were translated by scholars. Indian Buddhist teachers also traveled to faraway places, carrying texts to disseminate the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhist texts were preserved in manuscripts for several centuries in monasteries in different parts of Asia. Modern translations have been prepared from Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan texts. Okay, figure 4.4 shows a Buddhist manuscript in Sanskrit circa 12th century. Okay. Fatalists and materialists. Here is an excerpt from the Sutta Pitaka describing a conversation between King Ajatashatru, the ruler of Magadha, and the Buddha. On one occasion, King Ajatashatru visited the Buddha and described what another teacher named Makkali Kosala had told him. Okay, so the wise should hope by this virtue, by this penance, I will gain karma. And the fool should, by the same means, hope to gradually rid himself of his karma. Neither of them can do it. Pleasure and pain, measured out as it were, cannot be altered in the course of samsara, transmigration. It can neither be lessened or increased, just as a ball of string will, when thrown, unwind to its full length. So fool and wise alike will take their course and make an end of sorrow. And this is what a philosopher named Ajita Keshakambalin taught. There is no such thing, O king, as alms of or sacrifices or offerings. There is no such thing as this world or the next. Okay. Okay. The first teacher belonged to the tradition of the Ajivikas. They have often been described as fatalists, those who believe that everything is predetermined. The second teacher belonged to tradition of Logayadas, usually described as materialists. Texts from these traditions have not survived, so we know about them only from the works of other traditions. Okay. So Ajita Kesha Kamblin is belong to Logayadas, and Makali Kosala belong to Ajivikas. Okay. Beyond worldly pleasures, the message of Mahavira. Beyond worldly pleasures, the message of Mahavira. The basic philosophy of Jainas was already in existence in North India before the birth of Vardhamana, who came to be known as Mahavira in the 6th century BCE. According to Jaina tradition, Mahavira was preceded by 23 other teachers or Tirthankaras, literally those who guide men and women across the river of existence. Okay. 4.5, figure 4.5 depicts an image of Tirthankara from Mathura, circa 3rd century CE. Okay, the most important idea in Jainism is that the entire world is animated. Even stones, rocks, and water have life. Non-injury to living beings, especially to humans, animals, plants, and insects, is central to Jaina philosophy. In fact, the principle of ahimsa, emphasized within Jainism, has left its mark on Indian thinking as a whole. According to Jaina teachings, the cycle of birth and rebirth is shaped through karma. Asceticism and penance are required to free oneself from the cycle of karma. This can be achieved only by renouncing the world. Therefore, monastic existence is a necessary condition of salvation. Jaina monks and nuns took 5 vows: to abstain from killing, stealing, and lying, to observe celibacy, and to abstain from possessing property. Okay, the world beyond the palace. Just as Buddha's teachings were compiled by his followers, the teachings of Mahavira were also recorded by his disciples. These were often in the form of stories which could appeal to ordinary people. Here is one example from a Prakrit text known as Uttaradhyayana Sutta, describing how a queen named Kamalavati tried to persuade her husband to renounce the world. If the whole world and all its treasures were yours, you would not be satisfied, or nor would all this be able to save you. When you die, O king, and leave all things behind, Dhamma alone and nothing else will save you. As a bird dislikes the cage, so do I dislike the world. I shall live as a nun without offspring, without desire, without the love of gain, and without hatred. Those who have enjoyed pleasures and renounced them move about like the wind and go wherever they please, unchecked like birds in their flight. Leave your large kingdom, abandon what pleases the senses, be without attachment and property, and practice severe penance, being firm of energy. Okay, the spread of Jainism. Jainism spread to many parts of India. Gradually, Jainism spread to many parts of India. Like the Buddhist, Jaina scholars produced a wealth of literature in variety of languages, Prakrit, Sanskrit, and Tamil. For centuries, manuscripts of these texts were carefully preserved in libraries attached to temples. Some of the earliest stone sculptures associated with religious traditions were produced by devotees of the Jaina Tirthankaras and have been recovered from several sites throughout the subcontinent. Figure 4.6 depicts a page from a 14th century Jaina manuscript. Okay. The Buddha and the quest for enlightenment. One of the most influential teachers of the time was Buddha. Over the centuries, his message spread across the subcontinent and beyond, through Central Asia to China, Korea, Japan, and through Sri Lanka, across the seas to Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia. How do we know about Buddha's teachings? These have been reconstructed by carefully editing, translating, and analyzing the Buddhist texts mentioned earlier. Historians have also tried to reconstruct details of his life from hagiographies. Okay, many of these were written down at least a century after the time of Buddha in an attempt to preserve memories of the great leader. Hagiography is a biography of a saint or religious leader. Hagiographies often praise the saint's achievement and may not always be literally accurate. They are important because they tell us about the beliefs of the followers of that particular tradition. According to these traditions, Siddhartha, as the Buddha was named at birth, was the son of a chief of the Sakya clan. He had a sheltered upbringing within the palace, insulated from the harsh realities of life. One day he persuaded his charioteer to take him to the city. His first journey into the world outside was traumatic. He was deeply anguished when he saw an old man, a sick man, and a corpse. He realized he realized in that moment that the decay and destruction of human body was inevitable. He also saw a homeless mendicant who it seemed to him had come to terms with old age, disease, and death, and found peace. Siddhartha decided that he too would adopt the same path. Soon after, he left the palace and set out in search of his own truth. Siddhartha explored several paths, including bodily mortification, led which led him to a situation of near death. Abandoning these extreme methods, he meditated for several days and finally attained enlightenment. After this, he came to be known as the Buddha or the Enlightened One. For the rest of his life, he taught Dhamma or path of righteous living. Okay, figure 4.7 shows a sculpture circa 200th century CE from Amravati, Andhra Pradesh, depicting the departure of the Buddha from his palace. Okay. The teachings of Buddha. The teachings of the Buddha. The Buddha's teachings have been reconstructed from stories mainly found in the Sutta Pitaka. Although some stories describe his miraculous powers, others suggest that the Buddha tried to convince people through reason and persuasion rather than through displays of supernatural power. For instance, when a grief stricken when a grief stricken woman whose child had died came to Buddha, he gently convinced her about the inevitability of death rather than bringing her son back to life. These stories were narrated in the language spoken by ordinary people so that these could be easily understood. According to Buddhist philosophy, the world is transient, anika, and constantly changing. Okay. It is also soulless, anada, as there is nothing permanent or eternal in it. Within this transient world, sorrow, dukkha, is intrinsic to human existence. It is by following the path of moderation between severe penance and self indulgence that human beings can rise above these worldly troubles. In the earliest forms of Buddhism, whether or not God existed was irrelevant. Buddhism in practice. This is an excerpt from the Sutta Pitaka and contains the advice given by the Buddha to a wealthy householder named Sigala. Okay, in 5 ways should a master look after his servants and employees: by assigning them work according to their strength, by supplying them with food and wages, by tending them in sickness, by sharing delicacies with them, and by granting leave at times. In 5 ways should the clansman look after the needs of samanas, those who have renounced the world, and the brahmanas, by affection in act and speech and mind, by keeping open house to them and supplying their worldly needs. There are similar instructions to Sigala about how to behave with his parents, teacher, and wife. Okay, the Buddha regarded the social world as the creation of humans rather than divine origin. Therefore, he advised the kings and Gahapatis to be humane and ethical. Individual effort was expected to transform social relations. The Buddha emphasized individual agency and righteous action as the means to escape from the cycle of rebirth and attain self realization and nibbana, literally, the extinguishing of the ego and desire, and thus end the cycle of suffering for those who renounce the world. According to Buddhist tradition, in his last words to his followers were, "Be lambs unto yourself. Be lambs unto yourself, as all of you must work out your own liberation." Followers of the Buddha. Soon there grew a body of disciples of the Buddha, and he founded a sangha, an organization of monks who too became teachers of Dhamma. These monks lived simply, possessing only the essential requisites for survival, such as a bowl to receive food once a day from the laity. Okay. As they lived on alms, they were known as bhikkhus. Initially, only men were allowed into the sangha, but later women also came to be admitted. According to Buddhist texts, this was made possible through the meditation of Ananda, one of the Buddha's dearest disciples, who persuaded him to allow women into sangha. The Buddha's foster mother, Mahapajapati Gautami, was the first woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni. Many women who entered the Sangha became teachers of Dhamma and went on to become theories or respected women. Theories or respected women who had attained liberation. Okay, the Buddha's followers came from many social groups. They included kings, wealthy men, and Grahapatis, and also humbler folk, such as workers, slaves, and craft people. Once within the Sangha, all were regarded as equal, having shed their earlier social identities on becoming bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. The internal functioning of the Sangha was based on the traditions of Ganas and Sanghas, where consensus were arrived at through discussions. If that failed, decisions were taken by a vote on the subject. Okay, the Teri Gada. This unique Buddhist text, part of the Sutta Pitaka, is a collection of verses composed by bhikkhunis. It provides an insight into women's social and spiritual experiences. Punna, a dasi or slave woman, went to the river each morning to fetch water for her master's household. She would daily see a Brahmana performing bathing rituals. One morning she spoke to him. The following are verses composed by Punna, recording her conversation with the Brahmana. I am a water carrier. Even in the cold, I have always gone down to the water, frightened of punishment, or the angry words of high class women. So, what are you afraid of, Brahmana? That makes you go down to the water, though your limbs shake with the bitter cold. The Brahmana replied, I am doing good to prevent evil. Anyone, young or old, who has done something bad is freed by washing in water. Punna said, whoever told you, you are freed from evil by washing in the water? In that case, all the frogs and turtles would go to heaven, and so would the water snakes and crocodiles. Instead, don't do that thing, the fear of which leads you to the water. Stop now, Brahmana. Save your skin from the cold. Okay, the figure 4.8 shows a women water carrier, Mathura. Okay, circa 3rd century CE. Okay, rules for monks and nuns. These are some of the rules laid down in Vinaya Pidaka. So rules are laid down in Vinaya Pidaka. Okay, when a new felt blanket or rug has been made by a bhikkhu, it is to be kept for at least 6 years. If after less than 6 years, he should have another new felt blanket or rug made, regardless of whether or not he has disposed the first. Then, unless he has been authorized by the bhikkhus, it is to be forfeited and confessed. In case a bhikkhu arriving at a family residence is presented with cakes or cooked grain meal, he may accept 2 or 3 bowlfuls if he so desires. If he should accept more than that, it is to be confessed. Having accepted the 2 or 3 bowlfuls and having taken them from there, he is to share them among the bhikkhus. This is the proper course here. Should any bhikkhu having set out bedding in a lodging belonging to the Sangha, or having had it set out, and then on departing neither put it away nor have it put away, or should he go without taking leave, it is to be confessed. Buddhism grew rapidly both during the lifetime of the Buddha and after his death, as it appealed to many people dissatisfied with existing religious practices and confused by the rapid social changes taking place around them. The importance attached to conduct and values rather than claims of superiority based on birth. The emphasis based on metta, fellow feeling, and karuna, compassion. especially for those who were younger and weaker than oneself, were ideas that drew men and women to Buddhist teachings. Okay, stupas. We have seen that Buddhist ideas and practices emerged out of a process of dialogue with other traditions, including those of the Brahmanas, Jainas, and several others. Not all of those ideas, all of whose ideas and practices were preserved in texts. Some of these interactions can be seen in the ways in which sacred places came to be identified. From earliest times, people tended to regard certain places as sacred. These included sites with special trees or unique rocks, or sites of inspiring natural beauty. These sites with smaller shrines attached to them were sometimes described as chaityas. Buddhist literature mentions several chaityas. It also describes places associated with the Buddha's life, where he was born, Lumbini, where he attained enlightenment, Bodh Gaya, where he gave his first sermon, Sarnath, and where he attained Nibbana, Kushinagara. Okay. Gradually, each of these places came to be regarded as sacred. We know that about 200 years after the time of the Buddha, Ashoka erected a pillar at Lumbini to mark the fact that he had visited the place. Okay. Chaitya may also have been derived from the word chitta, meaning a funeral pyre, and by extension, a funerary mound. Okay, map 1, major Buddhist sites. Which are they? Okay, Amaravati, Nagarjuna Konda, Karle, Junnar, Nasik, Ajanta, Sanji, Barhut, Sarnath, Shravasti, Lumbini, Kushinagara, Barabar, Bodh Gaya. Okay. Why were stupas built? There were other places too that were regarded as sacred. This was because relics of the Buddha, such as his bodily remains or objects used by him, were buried there. These were mounds known as stupas. The tradition of erecting stupas may have been pre-Buddhist, but they came to be associated with Buddhism since they contained relics regarded as sacred. The entire stupa came to be venerated as an emblem of both Buddha and Buddhism. According to Buddhist text known as the Ashoka Ashoka distributed portions of the Buddha's relics to every important town and ordered the construction of stupas over them. By the 2nd century BCE, a number of stupas, including those at Barhut, Sanji, and Sarnath, had been built. How were stupas built? Inscriptions found on the railings and pillars of stupas record donations made for building and decorating them. Some donations were made by kings, such as Shadavahanas. Others were made by guilds, such as that of the ivory workers, who financed part of one of the gateways at Sanji. Hundreds of donations were made by women and men who mentioned their names, sometimes adding the name of the place from where they came, as well as their occupations and names of their relatives. Bhikkhus and bhikkhunis also contributed towards building their monuments. Okay. Why were stupas built? This is an excerpt from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, a part of Sutta Pidaka. Okay. As the Buddha lay dying, Ananda asked, "What are we do? What are we to do, Lord, with the remains of the Tathagata, another name of Buddha?" Tathagata is the another name of Buddha. The Buddha replied, "Hinder not yourself, Ananda, by honoring the remains of Tathagata. Tathagata, be zealous, be intent on your own good." But when pressed further, the Buddha said, "At the four crossroads, they should erect a stupa, Pali for stupa, to the Tathagata, and whosoever shall there place garlands or perfume, or make a salutation there, or become in its presence calm of heart, that shall long be to them for a profit and joy." Okay, the structure of the stupa. The stupa, a Sanskrit word leaping meaning a heap, originated as a simple semicircular mound of earth, later called anda. Gradually, it evolved into a more complex structure, balancing round and square shapes. Above the anda was the harmiga, a balcony-like structure that represented the abode of the gods. Okay. Figure 4.9 shows a votive inscription from Sanji. Hundreds of similar inscriptions have been found at Barhut and Amaravati. Okay. Arising from the Harmiga was a must called the Yashti, often surmounted by a chhatri or umbrella. Around the mound was a railing, separated the sacred space from the secular world. The early stupas at Sanji and Barhut were plain except for the stone railings, which resembled a bamboo or wooden fence, and the gateways, which were richly carved and installed at the four cardinal points. Worshippers entered through the eastern gateway and walked around the mount in a clockwise direction, keeping the mount on the right, imitating the sun's course through the sky. Later, the mount of the stupa came to be elaborately carved with the niches and sculptures, as at Amaravati, Shah Ji Ki Deri in Peshawar, Pakistan. Okay. Figure 4.10a shows the plan of a great stupa at Sanji. A plan provides a horizontal perspective of a building. Okay, figure 4.10b shows an elevation of the great stupa. An elevation provides a vertical perspective. Okay. Discoveries Discovering stupas, the fate of the Amaravati and Sanchi. Each stupa has a history of its own. Each stupa has a history of its own, as we have just seen. Some of these are histories of how they were built, but there are histories of discoveries as well. And let us now turn to some of these. In 1796, a local Raja who wanted to build a temple stumbled upon the ruins of the stupa at Amaravati. He decided to use the stone and thought there might be some treasure buried in what seemed to be a hill. Some years later, a British official named Colin Mackenzie visited the site. Although he found several pieces of sculpture and made detailed drawings on them or drawings of them, these reports were never published. Okay. Figure 4.11 shows the eastern gateway. Sanji. Okay, notice the vibrant sculpture. Okay, this is the eastern gateway of Sanji. Okay. In 1854, Walter Elliot, the commissioner of Gondor, Andhra Pradesh, visited Amravati and collected several sculpture panels and took them away to Madras. These came to be called the Elliot marbles after him. He also discovered the remains of the western gateway and came to the conclusion that the structure at Amravati was one of the largest and most magnificent Buddhist stupas ever built. By the 1850s, some of the slabs from Amaravati had begun to be taken to different places, to the Asiatic Society of Bengal at Calcutta, to the India office in Madras, and some even to London. It was not unusual to find these sculptures adorning the gardens of British administrators. In fact, any new official in the area continued to remove sculptures from the site on the grounds that earlier officials had done the same. One of the few men who had a different point of view was an archaeologist named H. Coley. He wrote, "It seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art." He believed that museums should have plaster cast facsimiles of sculpture, whereas the originals should remain where they had been found. Unfortunately, Kohli did not succeed in convincing the authorities about the Amaravati, although his plea for in situ preservation was adopted in the case of Sanji. Why did Sanji survive while Amaravati did not? Perhaps Amaravati was discovered before scholars understood the value of the finds and realized how critical it was to preserve things where they had been found instead of removing them from the site. When Sanji was discovered in 1818, three of its four gateways were still standing. The fourth was lying on the spot where it had fallen, and Mount was in good condition. Even so, it was suggested that the gateway be taken to either Paris or London. Finally, a number of factors helped to keep Sanji as it was, and so it stands. Whereas the Maha Chaitya at Amaravati is now just an insignificant little mound, totally denuded of its former glory. Okay, in situ means on the spot. Okay, figure 4.12 shows a dissection of the gateway. Do you think the sculptures that Sanji wanted to depict a scroll being unfurled? Okay, sculpture. We have seen that we have just seen how sculptures were removed from stupas and transported all the way to Europe. This happened partly because those who saw them considered them to be beautiful and valuable and wanted to keep them for themselves. Let us look at some of these more closely. Stories in stone. You may have seen wandering storytellers carrying scrolls, charana chitras of cloth or paper with pictures on them and pointing to the pictures as they tell the story. Okay, look at figure 4.13. Okay, part of the northern gateway. Okay, at first sight, this sculpture seems to depict a rural scene with thatched huts and trees. However, art historians who have carefully studied the sculpture at Sanji identify it as a scene from Vesandara Jataka. This is a story about a generous prince who gave away everything to Brahmana and went to live in the forest with his wife and children. As you can see in this case, historians often try to understand the meaning of culture by comparing it with textual evidence. Okay, figure 4.414, far right, worshipping the Bodhi tree. Notice the trees, the seat, and the people around it. Figure 4.15, middle right, okay, worshipping the stupa. Okay, figure 4.16 below, setting in motion the wheel of Dharma. Okay. Okay, symbols of worship. Art historians had to acquire familiarity with hagiographies of the Buddha in order to understand Buddhist culture. According to hagiographies, the Buddha attained enlightenment while meditating under a tree. Many early sculptures did not show the Buddha in human form. Instead, they showed his presence through symbols. The empty seat was meant to indicate the meditation of the Buddha. The stupa was meant to represent the Mahaparinibbana. Another frequently used symbol was the wheel. This stood for the first sermon of the Buddha delivered at Sarnath. As is obvious, such sculptures cannot be understood literally. For instance, the tree does not stand simply for a tree, but symbolizes an event in the life of the Buddha. In order to understand such symbols, historians have to familiarize themselves with the traditions of those who produced these works of art. Popular traditions. Okay, figure 4.7, the women at the gate. You can see here. Okay, popular traditions. Other sculptures at Sanji were perhaps not directly inspired by Buddhist ideas. These include beautiful women swinging from the edge of the gateway, holding onto tree for figure 4.7. Yeah. Okay, initially scholars were a bit intrigued about this image, which seemed to have little to do with renunciation. However, after examining other literary traditions, they really realized that it could be a representation of what is described in Sanskrit as Shalabanjiga. According to popular belief, this was a woman whose touch caused trees to flower and bear fruit. Okay, it is likely that this was regarded as an auspicious symbol and integrated into decoration of the stupa. The Shalabanjiga motif suggests that many people who turn to Buddhism enrich it with their own pre-Buddhist and even non-Buddhist beliefs, practices, and ideas. Some of the recurrent motifs in the sculpture at Sanji were evidently derived from these traditions. Okay, figure 4.18, an elephant at Sanji. You can see them here. Okay, there are other images as well. For instance, some of the finest depictions of animals are found there. These animals include elephants, horses, monkeys, and cattle. Okay. While the Jatakas contain several animal stories that are depicted at Sanji, it is likely that many of these animals were carved to create lively scenes to draw viewers. Also, animals were often used as symbols of human attributes. Elephants, for example, were depicted to signify strength and wisdom. Okay. Figure 4.19, Gaja Lakshmi. Okay. Figure 4.20, a painting from Ajanta. Note the seated figure and those serving him. Okay. Figure 4.21, a serpent at Sanji. Okay. Paintings from the past. While stone sculpture survives the ravages of time and is therefore most easily available to the historian, other visual means of communication, including paintings, were also used in the past. Those that have survived best are on walls of caves, of which those from Ajanta, Maharashtra, are the most famous. The paintings at Ajanta depict stories from the Jatakas. These include depictions of country life, processions, men and women at work, and festivals. The artists used the technique of shading to give a three-dimensional quality. Some of the paintings are extremely naturalistic. Okay, another motif is that of a woman surrounded by lotuses and elephants, which seem to be a sprinkling water on her as if performing an abhishega or consecration. While some historians identify the figure as Maya, the mother of the Buddha, others identify her with a popular goddess, Gajalakshmi, literally the goddess of good fortune, who is associated with elephants. It is also possible that devotees who saw these sculptures identified the figure with both Maya and Gajalakshmi. Consider too the serpent, which is found on several pillars. These motifs seem to be derived from popular traditions, which were not always recorded in texts. Interestingly, one of the earliest modern art historians, James Ferguson, considered Sanji to be a center of tree and serpent worship. He was not familiar with Buddhist literature, most of which had not yet been translated, and arrived at this conclusion by studying only the images on their own. New religious traditions, the development of Mahayana Buddhism. Figure point 4.22, an image of Buddha from Mathura, the circa 1st century CE. Okay, the development of Mahayana Buddhism. By the 1st century CE, there is evidence of changes in Buddhist ideas and practices. Early Buddhist teachings had given great importance to self-effort in achieving Nibbana. Besides, the Buddha was regarded as a human being who attained enlightenment and Nibbana through his own efforts. However, gradually the idea of savior emerged. It was believed that he was the only one who could ensure salvation. Simultaneously, the concept of bodhisattva also developed. Bodhisattvas were perceived as deeply compassionate beings who accumulated merit through their efforts but used this not to attain nibbana and thereby abandon the world, but to help others. The worship of images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas became an important part of this tradition. This new way of thinking was called Mahayana, literally the great vehicle. Those who adopted these beliefs described the old tradition as Hinayana or the lesser vehicle, Hinayana or Theravada. Supporters of the Mahayana regarded other Buddhists as followers of Hinayana. However, followers of the older tradition described themselves as Theravadins, that is, those who followed the path of old, respected teachers, and Theras, the Theras. Okay. Figure 4.23, the Varaha or Boar, avatar of Vishnu, rescuing the earth goddess. I hold Karnataka, circa 6th century CE. Okay, you can see them here. The growth of Puranic Hinduism. The notion of a savior was not unique to Buddhism. We find similar ideas being developed in different ways within traditions that we now consider part of Hinduism. These included Vaishnavism, a form of Hinduism within which Vishnu was worshipped as the principal deity, and Shaivism, a tradition within which Shiva was regarded as the chief god, in which there was growing emphasis on the worship of a chosen deity. In such worship, the bond between the devotee and the god was visualized as one of love and devotion or bhakti. In the case of Vaishnavism, cults developed around the various avatars or incarnations of the deity. 10 avatars were recognized within the tradition. These were forms that the deity was believed to have assumed in order to save the world whenever it was threatened by disorder and destruction because of the dominance of evil forces. It is likely that different avatars were popular in different parts of the country. Recognizing each of these local deities as a form of Vishnu was one way of creating a more unified religious traditions. Some of these forms were represented in sculptures, as were other deities. Shiva, for instance, was symbolized by the linga, although he was occasionally represented in human form too. All such representations depicted a complex set of ideas about the deities and their attributed at their attributes through symbols such as head dresses, ornaments, ayudas, weapons, or auspicious objects the deities hold in their hands, how they are seated, etc. To understand the meanings of these cultures, historians have to familiar with the stories behind them, many of which are contained in the Puranas, compiled by Brahmanas by about the middle of the first millennium CE. They contained much that had been composed and been in circulation for centuries, including stories about the gods and goddesses. Generally, they were written in simple Sanskrit words and were meant to be read aloud to everybody, including women and Shudras who did not have access to Vedic learning. Much of what is contained in the Puranas evolved through interaction amongst the people, priests, merchants, and ordinary men and women who traveled from place to place sharing ideas and beliefs. We know, for instance, that Vasudeva Krishna was an important deity in the Madura region. Over the centuries, his worship spread to other parts of the country as well. Okay. Figure 4.24 shows an image of Durga, Mahabalipuram, Tamil Nadu, circa 6th century CE. Okay, you can see them here. Building temples. Around the time that the stupas at sites such as Sanji were acquiring their present form, the first temples to house images of gods and goddesses were also being built. The early temple was a small square room called the Garbhagriha with a single doorway for the worshipper to enter and offer worship to the image. Gradually, a tall structure known as the Shikara was built over the central shrine. Temples walls were often decorated with sculpture. The later temples became far more elaborate, with assembly halls, huge walls, and gateways and arrangements for supplying water. One of the unique features of early temples was that some of these were hollowed out of huge rocks as artificial caves. The tradition of building artificial caves was an old one. Some of the earliest, figure 4.27, of these were, okay, figure 4.27, entrance to a cave at Barabar, Bihar, circa 3rd century BCE. Okay, some of the earliest of these were constructed in the 3rd century BCE in on the orders of Ashoka for renouncers who belonged to the Ajivika sect. Okay, figure 4.26 shows the Vishnu reclining on the serpent Sheshnag sculpture from Deogar, Uttar Pradesh, circa 5th century CE. Okay. Here you can see in figure 4.25 a temple in Deogar, Uttar Pradesh, circa 5th century CE. Okay. This tradition evolved through various stages and culminated much later in the 8th century in the carving out of an entire temple, that of Kailashanada, a name of Shiva. A copper plate inscription records the amazement of the chief sculptor after he completed the temple at Ellora. Oh, how did I make it? Okay. Figure 4.28 Kailashanada Temple, Ellora, Maharashtra. This entire structure is carved out of a single piece of rock. Okay, can we see everything? By now, you have had a glimpse of the rich visual traditions that existed in the past, expressed in brick and stone architecture, sculpture, and painting. We have seen that much has been destroyed and lost over the centuries. Nevertheless, what remains and has been preserved conveys a sense of the vision of the artists, sculptors, masons, and architects who created these spectacular works. Yet, do we always automatically understand what they wanted to convey? Can we ever know what these images meant to people who saw them and venerated them about 2000 years ago? Grappling with the unfamiliar. It will be useful to recall that when 19th century European scholars first saw some of these sculptures of gods and goddesses, they could not understand what these were about. Sometimes they were horrified by what seemed to be seen to them grotesque figures with multiple arms and heads, or with combination of humans and animal forms. These early scholars tried to make sense of what appeared to be strange images by comparing them with sculpture with which they were familiar, that from ancient Greece. While they often found early Indian sculpture inferior to the works of Greek artists, they were very excited when they discovered images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that were evidently based on Greek models. These were most often than not found in the northwest, in cities such as Taxila and Peshawar, where Indo-Greek rulers had established kingdoms in the 2nd century BCE. As these images were closest to the Greek statues these scholars were familiar with, they were considered to be the best examples of the early Indian art. In effect, these scholars adopted a strategy we all frequently use, devising yardsticks derived from the familiar to make sense of the unfamiliar. Okay. Figure 2.49, a bodhisattva from Gandhara, not the clothes and the hairstyle. Okay. Okay. If text and image do not match, consider another problem. We have seen that art historians often draw upon textual traditions to understand the meaning of this culture. While this is certainly a far more efficacious strategy than comparing Indian images in with Greek statues. It is not always easy to use. One of the most intriguing examples of this is a famous sculpture along a huge rock surface in Mahabalipuram, Tamil Nadu. Clearly, figure 4.30 is a vivid depiction of a story, but which story is it? Art historians have searched through the Puranas to identify it and are sharply divided in their opinions. Some feel that this depicts the descent of the river Ganga from heaven. The natural cleft through the river, through the center of the rock surface might represent the river. The story itself is narrated in the Puranas and the epics. Others feel that it represents a story from the Mahabharata, Arjuna doing penance on the river bank in order to acquire alms, pointing to the central figure of an ascetic. Figure 4.30, a sculpture in Mahabalipuram. Okay. Finally, remember that Many rituals, religious beliefs, and practices were not recorded in a permanent, visible form as monuments or sculpture or even paintings. These included daily practices as well as those associated with special occasions. Many communities and people may not have felt the need for keeping lasting records, even as they may have had vibrant traditions of religious activities and philosophical ideas. In fact, the spectacular instances we have focused on in this chapter are just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, timeline one, major religious developments. Circa 1500 to 1000 BCE, early Vedic traditions. 1000 to 500 BCE, later Vedic traditions. 6th century BCE, early Upanishads, Jainism, Buddhism. 3rd century BCE, first Subhas. 2nd century BCE onwards, development of Mahayana Buddhism, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and goddess cults. 3rd century BCE, earliest temples. Timeline 2, landmarks in the discovery and preservation of early monuments and sculpture. 19th century, 1814, founding of the Indian Museum, Calcutta. 1834, publication of Essay on the Architecture of the Hindus by Ram Raja. Cunningham explores the Stupa at Sarnath. 1835 to 1842, James Ferguson surveys major archaeological sites. 1851, establishment of the Government Museum, Madras. 1854, Alexander Cunningham publishes Bilsa Topes, one of the earliest works on Sanji. 1878, Rajendra Lala Mitra publishes Buddha Gaya, the heritage of Shakyamuni. 1880, H.H. Kohli appointed curator of ancient monuments. 1888, passing of the Treasure Trove Act, giving the government the right to acquire all objects of archaeological interest. 20th century, 1914, John Marshall and Alfred Foucher published the Monuments of Sanji. 1923, John Marshall publishes the Conservation Manual. 1955, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru lays the foundation stone of the National Museum, New Delhi. In 1989, Sanji declared a World Heritage Site. Okay, so we have completed the chapter theme 4. Okay, figure 4.31 depicts a sculpture in Sanji. Okay, then figure 4.32, figure 4.33. So we have covered themes in Indian history part 1, which is ancient India holistically. Thank you for listening me. Next we will discuss ancient India, old NCRT by R.S. Sharma. Okay, thank you for listening me. See you in next class. Thank you very much.